And I'm ready. Just give everyone a moment to catch up on the stream. All right, good evening. Welcome to the second episode of Liberty Chat Victorian State Election Edition. I am your host, Kate Fantinel-Lady Liberty, and I am here in Melbourne, Victoria on the battleground, helping out with one of the most important elections in our party's history and in the state of Victoria's history. I am in Parliament House. I've taken over David Limbrick's office. Don't worry, it's not a coup. He is at his citizenship ceremony tonight, so he'll be joining us again on another episode. But I have three very special guests tonight. And the first one needs no introduction, but I'm going to give him one anyway. So this person is a self-described mild-mannered accountant from the bush. He served as a councillor on the Wodonga Council for the Liberal Democrats. He was a farmer on his family property in southern New South Wales, but is a proud Victorian now. Upon his election in 2018, he promised he would make waves, throw grenades and ruffle feathers for the people of Northern Victoria. And it's fair to say he ruffled the feathers of the Premier himself just yesterday. So ladies and gentlemen, I introduce to you a man who needs no introduction, the member for Northern Victoria, Tim Quilty. Welcome to the show, Tim. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me on. I think this would be my second appearance on Liberty Chat ever, even the whole time it's been going.
Oh, well, it's a pleasure to have you. And thank you for making time for us because we know regional Victoria is being slammed by floods at the moment. I'm not going to call them unprecedented because we've had this happen before, but you were in the news for calling out the vaccine mandates on the SES volunteers because, as you rightly pointed out, if people need rescuing, why does it matter if they're vaccinated or not? Can you tell us a little bit about that and how did it feel having the Premier refer to you as that person?
All right. So obviously we've had the mandates officially lifted across the state, the declaration ending. But what they've done is pressured all the public service departments and so on to implement their own mandates to keep enforcing it. So that for the SES, if they haven't had 3 vaccines, they're not allowed to help in routine operations. If they haven't had 2, they can't even help in life or death situations. Now we know that 95% of the Victorian population have had their 2 shots, but only 70% have had the 3rd one. And so the Premier says it's only a very tiny number of people who are affected, but it could be up to 30% of the SES volunteers if they match the general population there. It's ridiculous that in a time of emergency, they're still turning away volunteers and saying you can't do it. SES are well trained in safety and health, so it's not like they're posing a huge risk to people. We know the vaccines don't stop transmission. That's been the big story for the last few weeks or months. And so all the justification for it was never justified in the first place, but the justification they tried to make has now fallen to pieces. But it's still happening, and the government can say, it's not us doing it; it's the departments. They've made their own decisions. But obviously, if you know anything about this government, it all focuses back to very tight control over everything. So anyway, so that's the mandate issue. We shouldn't be locking up 30% of volunteers, potential volunteers, in an emergency situation. If then someone just said, what happens if they help and they're unvaccinated? Well, they can help as general public, but they can't help as a SES. They'll just be turned away. They won't be allowed to participate. So I've had this complaint from people for months now. I've been contacting my office from the SES and the CFA saying they're not allowed to participate. They can go to emergency call-outs, but otherwise they're not allowed to participate in what's going on. They can't go to training. They can't attend events at their sheds. They can't participate with their crews. and all of it's rubbish, obviously. Anyway, hopefully the stupidity of doing an emergency situation brings it home to people. And this is a flood situation. Later in the year, we'll have fires, and it'll be the same thing with the CFA. So it's not good enough. It should stop. It baffles me why it is still going on, but it is. You talked about floods in general. And yes, obviously we know there's floods all across Northern Victoria. The Northern Victorian electorate is the whole length of the Murray River from right up from where it starts in the mountains, the watershed on this side of the mountains, all the way to the South Australian border, and then it runs down to the outskirts of Melbourne, including Bendigo. So it's a big area. It's 102,000 square kilometres, as we recently looked up. So I've been repeating that non-stop ever since. It's huge, and a lot of it is flat, very, very flat, floodplains and just generally flat areas. And when it floods, when you get a big flood, there's a lot of water out there, and as you see it, and it moves slowly. So the flood crisis in one town will, in 5 days' time, be a flood crisis in the next one down the river. We have all the feeder rivers that flow into the Murray, and they're all in trouble. And the Murray's running at Echuca now. It's peaking about now. And then there's probably more rain coming if you look at the forecast. So we might get through the emergency, but then the exact same thing will happen, could possibly happen in a few days or a week. And it could be happening all summer for all we know. So I don't know. What that drives home to me is the fact we need to fix our flood things before it's flooding. We see people making sandbags and building up levee banks. It would be a great idea if we'd fixed our levee banks before the flood got here. And I was hearing stories of farmers who wanted to repair the levee banks on their land or next to their land on Crown land, and being told they'd be prosecuted if they did anything to fix the levee bank. We've heard stories that no one knows who's responsible for. We put up big new levees around some places in the last 20 to 30 years, but no one's been maintaining them. Private landholders can do it, but they might get into trouble. Councils say it's not their job. And because we had all these people running around saying it will never rain again, will never be a flood, we've got people got the mentality that it wasn't important. Quite clearly it is. We'll have to, indefinitely in the future, we'll have to maintain our levee banks. Common sense would say let's do it before the floods, but there's not a lot of common sense comes out of Melbourne. You said at the start I was a proud Victorian. Now I'm a proud regional Victorian.
My mistake. I'll just pick you up on your comments about the Murray-Darling. So the Murray-Darling Basin Plan, I'm very familiar with that because I'm from South Australia. Also familiar with it because of New South Wales in former Senator David Leyonhjelm's office. It was an issue. So the floods and the water that's been added from the rains, they won't be factored into the plan. What's your position on the Murray-Darling Basin Plan, and do you think the Victorian government has done enough in advocating for Victorians not to sell them out down the river?
No, the short answer is no. The whole plan is a disaster. It's a economic disaster for regional Victoria. They're ripping all this water out of communities to send, and we like to blame South Australia. So we send it to South Australia so that they can sail their yachts on the freshwater lakes that shouldn't even be there, the estuary mouth. But ultimately they've taken too much water out of the irrigation to use as environmental flows to the point where they can't fit it down the river. So a bunch of things happen. They reformed the water system. They let people trade water. It was supposed to be a wonderful thing, but they were supposed to move water from low value use to high value use. But a whole bunch of things, they made a lot of mistakes in it. They didn't factor in river capacity, so they took a lot of water from high up the river and moved it low down the river where the land was cheap, and now they can't get it down the river. They took a whole lot of water out for environmental flows, and now they have too much water. They can't use it. It's building up in the dams every year, the environmental water, forcing out actual useful water they could be using for irrigators. They're embarrassed by it. They try and they don't know what to do with it. They pour it on places like the Barmar Forest where they flood it every year now, and they're killing the forest. They flood it because they use the water, but also they flood it to force water past the Barmar choke they can get more water downstream. Anyway, they're doing massive damage to the river forest there with their environmental flows. We could talk about that. The stupid things go on all day, and with a few drinks, I probably will. But the other one more issue with water is transparency in the market. We have a lot of water traders coming in, buying up the water, and then dribbling it back onto the market where desperate farmers need it, and they don't know how much is available, and they force the price up and up and up. So we're free market. If you see the sign there, we're into free markets, but markets should be transparent as well. People should need the information. So the water markets need some reform around transparency, so everyone knows how much water is available. And I think there's a lot of stuff we could do with that. But yes, anyway, the Murray-Darling Basin is a disaster. Plate Basin plan, the whole basin is a disaster, but the plan is a disaster. There's still, we had the federal government previous federal government didn't fix it, but they stalled and didn't push it any harder. But now with the change of government federally, they're going to push through more reform, take more water out of communities. And when you take the water, dairy farming, you might have a town with 50 dairy farmers and it supports a dairy factory. When you take enough of those farmers out of the system, there's not enough milk to run the factory. The factory shuts down. The farmers can't sell their milk. So the whole town ends up drying up and blowing away. Meanwhile, we're watering some trees that didn't need it and running fresh water out to sea in South Australia. It's nonsense. We should build more dams. And we see in the last few years, they decommissioned the whole series of small water storages to save water because of evaporation. So now when we have a big flood with endless amounts of water going down the river, they can't store that. We should build more dams high up in the scheme. We should also use our smaller storages for flood events like this. And as you mentioned at the start, floods don't count as environmental flows. So all the water that goes down the river is just not counted in the plan at all. As soon as the floods stop, they'll still be trying to push environmental water down the river because they've got to get rid of it. None of it makes any sense. Like so many things that happen in regional Australia, it's driven by green-leaning voters in the city who are told these are environmental flows. They're good for the environment. They're actually doing extraordinary damage to everything, but it wins votes in the city, and that's all the city governments are interested in.
Well, your region and your electorate is the biggest in the state. It's the largest regional electorate, Northern Victoria. Where have you been throughout the last few weeks on your campaign? How many kilometres have you travelled? How many more kilometres do you think you'll do between now and the election day? And how bad is it out there in your communities in terms of the floods?
Right. So a couple of weeks ago, I went to the Elmore Field Days, which is the big agricultural field day. And that's a place where people come and bring tractors and machinery, and everyone who trades in agricultural industry comes there to display their wares, and the farmers all come out, and they run for 3 days approximately. We always went to Henty Field Days when I was a kid. The Elmore Field Days is the second biggest field day in Australia after Henty Field Days. It was very wet out there. I got my car bogged in the car park on the second day. I got covered in mud, and I was trying to cart stuff from my car to the pavilion and fell over in the mud, and I picked it up and I got covered in mud. And then the car got bogged. I had to get someone to pull me out. I have a nice little Volvo I drive around in, S60, but it's not 4-wheel drive, and that's going to be a problem in the mud. Anyway, so Elmore Field Days happened, and then the next week we went on a 5-day trip. We left Wodonga, drove all the way to Mildura, and worked our way back up the river, dropping into a whole series of communities on the way. And we basically just beat the rain and the floods all the way through. We had a really good, nice weather on the first day, and then it started raining. But heavy rain was always on one side or the other side of us, or behind us, or ahead of us. And we saw the river rising, but the actual floods were all happened behind us as we got back to Wodonga safely. And then, so we didn't actually see the flooded towns or fill any sandbags, but we could see the river rising and the problem happening. And this Monday, Tuesday, we went down to Alexandra and around the north central part of the electorate. talking to timber workers and looking at logging sites, which timber industry, another one being totally destroyed by the Victorian Labor government for no reason. We have a fantastic sustainable timber industry producing a really valuable product, and the Greens and the government want to shut it all down and import timber from unregulated sites in it's at rainforest places. So so it's a terrible thing, but we won't even go there yet. Where was I? So the flooding. Obviously, we haven't personally seen or been involved in any actual floods, but we've seen where the floods have been in the high country, and we were where the floods are now. It's obviously, if you live on a floodplain, you have to expect floods from time to time. And so far, this flood is not the biggest flood we've ever had in Victoria. It's third or fourth. If we keep getting more rain and more flood water arising, the floods might get bigger. What's different to this flood to some of the recent ones we've had is that the Darling River is also in flood. In recent years, we've only had the Murray flooding. So at the far west of Victoria into South Australia, we've now got two sources of water pouring down, and the floods at that end might be getting towards record floods. But yeah, if the rain keeps coming, we're going to have, we could well be looking at record floods. And asked questions about building dams. I asked one just recently, and the government's response was, we can't build dams, there won't never be enough water to fill them. It's a waste of money. So this is a mentality of the city Greens that they have. When I say Greens, I don't necessarily mean the Green Party. I mean all the people who tend to care about the environment while knowing nothing about it in the city. They have this mentality that it's not going to rain again, and quite clearly it is, and it will continue to rain. And we built our irrigation system to catch water in wet years and put it out in dry years to grow food, and we seem to have lost complete sight of that. And once again, I say it's complete nonsense. It makes no sense.
Yeah. So if you've just joined us, this is Tim Quilty. He is the member for Northern Victoria for the Liberal Democrats. He's recontesting his seat at the upcoming state election. Now, I just want to turn your mind back for a moment, if I may, Tim. So if you can cast your mind back to New Year's Eve 2020 going into 21, if you can remember where you were. I don't remember where I was. But you're in the border town of Albury and Wodonga. And on that New Year's Eve, the government decided to close the border with very little notice. So there was a situation created where residents got stranded on either side of the border. Where were you? What was that like? And can you tell us a little bit about your experience during living on a border community during the pandemic?
So I originally thought you were talking about 1920 New Year's Eve, where I got stuck fighting bushfires that year. And we thought the big fire that came through and burned for weeks and was going to be the big event of the whole 4 years. And then a couple of months down the track, and it was completely literally forgotten about, buried by COVID. In 2021, I was actually in the same place. I was up at my parents' farm at Adelong in southern New South Wales with my two boys. When they closed the border, they did it in three goes, actually. So about a week earlier, they said they're going to close it to anyone from New South Wales. And that was the weekend. That was the day I drove my son up to leave him at the farm while I had to come back and work. So it was mostly with his grandparents and cousins. And driving back that night from Adelong to the border, the road was like peak hour traffic. There were thousands of cars coming from New South Wales trying to get into Victoria before they closed the border that night to anyone from New South Wales. Normally when I drive back on a Sunday night, there are trucks. And there's a few hundred trucks on the road and nothing else. But this was just wall-to-wall cars. Everyone from New South Wales wanted to get back to family in Victoria for Christmas were going down the road. Anyway, bring the clock forward to New Year's Day. The government announced on New Year's Eve that they were closing the border to anyone from outside the border bubble area at midnight on New Year's Eve. The border bubble area was lines on a map where if you lived close to the border, you had extra crossing rights to everyone else in Victoria. And people from New South Wales could cross it if they stayed in the bubble. People New South Wales in the bubble could cross if they stayed in the bubble as well. And the bubble was a nonsensical thing that changed and grew, and every week, like a big blob that grew and shrank and took in areas and left them out. The government just loved tweaking the regulations every week. Dan Andrews would get up and say something, and the rules would change. Anyway, they said everyone from outside the bubble had 5 or 6 hours to get across the border, and then everyone who lived in the bubble had another day on top of that. So, and then they were closing to everyone, even bubble residents at that point. So I didn't have to race because I knew I had another 24 hours. So we stayed and had a party there. But we saw all the way along the border, all the accommodation, all along the river. We had to talk to, obviously this is their peak season for the people who run those accommodation. We talked to them. They said people just got up in the middle of New Year's Eve parties. They had food left on the table. They just grabbed their stuff, got in the cars, and drove for the border. And you had people who've been partying all night. They're drunk, but they knew if they didn't get across the border, they're saying they're going to lose their jobs. Luckily, they had 4 or 5 or 6 hours in traffic in the queue to sober up before no one died. But anything could have happened. And you had people coming from all across New South Wales, and in Queensland or anywhere, trying to get home before the border closed. It was extraordinary, like something out of a war, mass exodus of people or return of anyway. And the cars were queued up for 6 hours, 8 hours at the border queue. They didn't close the border at 12 o'clock midnight when they said, because the queues were backed up for hours. So it was actually sometime probably 8 or 9 o'clock the next morning when the border closed. They couldn't get the cars through. It was extraordinary. I would never have imagined that kind of thing happening to us. That was the second border closure, because that was the one Victoria did to New South Wales, because previously New South Wales had done it to Victoria, and we lived through that. And then when they opened that border, we celebrated and thought this will never ever happen again. And then just a few weeks later, bang, Victoria did it in revenge to New South Wales. And then we had just more months. The Victorian border was a lot leakier than the New South Wales one. They didn't enforce it as hard. So if you lived on the border, you knew it wasn't that hard to get through, but still a lot of people got stranded. Victorians who couldn't get back across. We had refugee camps of Victorians all along the river trying to get permission to cross. Some people were stuck for weeks or months trying to get permission to cross, and some never did until that border reopened. You had people who had jobs to go back to, who had mortgages to pay, who were just stuck living in a tent in a showground, just every day begging to be allowed to cross and just getting rejections. So anyway, life on the border during lockdowns, so obviously Melbourne had the harshest lockdown. We had at times things less strict up here, but the border closures were a real nightmare for us. In Wodonga, my son went to preschool in Albury, and so when I was here trying to take him to preschool, he'd be in traffic for an hour each way, or an hour and a half each way, trying to get him across. People who live on the border work on the other side. On the first day when New South Wales closed the border, there were 10,000 people who couldn't, just in and around Albury Wodonga, couldn't get to work that day. When Gladys had the brain snap, let's close the border, having said she'd never do that, they just never even thought to consider what the impact would be on the border communities. We always said it was theatre, COVID theatre for the cities, saying we're keeping you safe, inflicting these costs on regional communities that really didn't do anything. But anyway, it disrupted economic life here altogether. People couldn't get to work, businesses couldn't open, kids couldn't go to school. When they brought in border bubbles, then it was a matter of papers, please. Stand in the queue and show your papers to see if you're permitted to cross or not. At one point went to a barbecue after the first border closure, before the second one, and the kids were playing border crossing, and they were getting in a queue, coming up, and they say papers, show your papers, where's your pass? And they hear you say, no, that's no good. Go to the back. No, you can cross. No, you. And it was hilarious, but also horrifying to think that was what kids were playing in Australia. Couldn't believe it. I still think it's absolute madness. The whole last 2.5 years, things they've done, no rational basis behind it. But here we are.
Yes. So speaking of madness, another question that I had was, what was it like when there were restrictions put in communities like yours when there were no COVID cases, and particularly across the border in a town that there was no restrictions? How did it feel like for you personally, but also what did you hear from your constituents?
It was ridiculous. Again, we had no cases, and Wodonga had no cases for I don't remember the times now, but well over the first year of the pandemic. Not a case here. Closest cases were in Melbourne, or we had a few outbreaks in Shepparton. The thing when there were outbreaks in regional towns, they got them under control quickly. Not like Melbourne. Small regional towns could actually nail it quickly and wrap it up. And that's why they could have allowed a lot more movement in the state, but they were just made rules for Melbourne and applied it to the whole state. And it was a nightmare. And everyone obviously, everyone in Victoria had to wear a mask, but in New South Wales, you could cross the border and go shopping without a mask on. Once the movement was happening again, that's what people did. No one shopped at all in Victoria. They all crossed the border so they could walk around without a mask on. Anyway, a whole series of stupid rules that made no sense. We called again and again for devolving of the rules to regional areas. We can manage ourselves, make rules that made sense for our communities. But this government never listened. Not listening is something this government is very good at.
I wanted to ask also, you put up a motion in May this year for a royal commission into the pandemic, which is something that our party campaigned on for the federal election. We're also running on that for the state election. Are you particularly interested in the difference between how it affected the city and the regions? And when you're re-elected, will you be pushing for a royal commission, and particularly for how it affected regional Victoria?
Absolutely, we're going to push for it. We need to see it. This was the most extraordinary thing done by government in Australia since the Second World War. Between state and federal governments, we've blown through $1 trillion. $1 trillion. And that's all borrowed money that it's never going to be paid back, as we're just going to pay interest on it forever. The health response, locking people in their houses, all the restrictions, the health impacts of the restrictions, they have almost certainly killed far more people with the restrictions than they would have done without the lockdowns. When you take into account the mental health issues, the suicides, when you take into health all the postponed medical treatments, the impacts of everyone who got fat during lockdowns, the health impacts of that is going to kill many thousands of people. The impact on kids, they've stopped playing sport. Little community, regional community sporting teams have nearly collapsed because no one came back to playing. We have 100 years of history of sports, but all the younger kids didn't come back when the pandemic was over. So there's a massive drop of sport participation. So the costs of what the government have done are huge. There's no one's checking their work, no one's checking their homework, no one's saying, was this effective? So sometimes when I talk about a royal commission, I think because I'd like to see the people who did this stuff prosecuted. But at the end of the day, what I want to see is someone to soberly weigh the evidence and say, actually, this was a complete disaster. Everything we've done was a mistake, and let's never, ever do that again. Instead, what we're going to have, if we don't get a royal commission, we don't investigate it properly, we're going to have people who write the history saying it was a massive success. We should do this every time there's an outbreak of something, and we'll end up doing it to ourselves again and again. We need to know really what happened, and a independent Royal Commission is the only way we're going to do that.
I want to take you back even further now to 2018 when you were first elected. In your first speech, not only did you quote Oliver Cromwell's "In the Name of God, Go" speech in the Rump Parliament of 1653, you also said, "The Libertarians have arrived, which is good news for the lovers of freedom, but not so good for those of you who want to use the government to force your will on others. We as adults have the right to make choices for ourselves. If you take away our freedom to choose, you have turned us into slaves. This is a totalitarian future that we fight against." Could you ever have imagined that when you made that speech in 2018, that Victoria and Australia would have become even more totalitarian?
No. I thought that was a hyperbole, if you like. I mean, it's been happening and it is happening, but I didn't think within a couple of years of that speech we would be literally living through police firing on protesters, people locked in their own homes, and everything that happened to us. So you can call it prophetic if you like, but I actually didn't predict any of this. So, interestingly, that government in Australia has been growing gradually more totalitarian over time. Over the last 100 years or 150 years, government has been growing bigger, taking more money, making more rules, employing more public servants, spreading its tentacles into more and more parts of our lives. But it's been happening slowly, and so most people don't really notice. And so it's like the story of the frogs boiling. Even like the frogs in the pot of water being boiled slowly, they don't notice. They keep swimming in the water. During the pandemic, someone turned the heat up hard, and suddenly a percentage of the population realized. Surprisingly large number didn't. They kept swimming in the water, boiling away. But there was a percentage of people who actually realized that heat's being turned up and something's going on. So, yes. Anyway, I didn't predict this, but we were in Parliament to fight against government overreach. No one expected them to turn it up to 11 suddenly, but when they did, we were there to fight it. Not that we stopped it, but we certainly made a principled fight against it. And I do think we forced changes on the government, held them to account, and they haven't walked away with clean hands like they would have liked to. And if we hadn't been there, there would have been no one at all speaking up about it.
Yes. And there's an iconic picture of yourself and David Limbrick holding up the signs behind me about let the kids play, and you've been credited for helping open the park. So we thank you for that. Another thing you said in your first speech was at the time you were elected, Melbourne was the most livable city in Australia, with people migrating back to Victoria. And you referred to the divide between Melbourne and the regions as a smashed avocado curtain. I see your smashed avocado curtain and I raise you an iron ore curtain, which is what I lived behind in Western Australia for the best part of 2 years. But has the regions experienced an increase in migration with people fleeing Melbourne from the harshest lockdowns in the world? Or has government overreach affected the regions just as badly as it's affected Melbourne?
So, yeah, there definitely was a movement to the regions during the lockdowns and the pandemic. And I don't think many of those people haven't gone back, because why would you? I wouldn't. So we did see 40,000 people or something, 50,000 people move out of Melbourne into regional Victoria, which reversed 100 years of history of people leaving the city, leaving regional areas and moving to the city. Didn't reverse a whole lot, but it's definitely there'll be a bump in the demographic trend of the disappearing of regional Victoria. It also caused the house prices in much of regional Victoria to double, and a lot of angst with locals who now can't afford a house, or the kids can't afford a house. They're saying, where our children live, where all the people who want to work, who are going to work in this town live. So there's been a big issue with that. Obviously, the housing problem everywhere in Australia, and the solution is to build more houses, which is part of our policy platform. We need to get the government out of the way, loosen restrictions, and let stuff be built. When you say that in the middle of a flood disaster, we obviously don't want to build houses on a floodplain with no protection at all. People should know if they're building on a floodplain, and they should build their house on stilts or something so the water can go underneath, and you can keep living in your house instead of letting it flood. But we need to allow people to build stuff in regional Victoria and the city. We need to build more housing until we get house prices falling. Sure, I've wandered off the question there somewhere.
That's okay. I have two more questions before we're going to bring on your number 2 in regional Northern Victoria, which is Tim Molesworth, double Tims. This is what you promised in your first speech, that you would be a voice for the regions, for country people, to stand up for law-abiding firearm owners, to oppose new national parks, to fight for farmers in the regions, to push for decentralisation of the public service, to fight for sensible speed limits, drug law reform, and everywhere the government steps on the right for people to choose, that you would speak out. Did you keep that promise?
I kept the promise insofar as I was a voice, and I think I was a voice in all of those areas. Everything you mentioned there was something we've spoken up about. I can't say I brought in sensible speed limits or saved the timber industry, but we've certainly fought hard on each and every one of those points and made it expensive for the government to move in those areas. So with more Lib Dems, we might have had more success, and with a bit of luck after this election, we'll have a couple more of us, and we can do an even better job of holding the government to account in those areas. But every one of those things is something I still strongly believe in, and we have fought hard for it, and we'll keep fighting hard for it.
My last question before we bring on Tim number 2, the very last word in your speech was freedom. And that's exactly what you did to your 2 beautiful boys in the gallery. Do you think Victorians still value freedom, particularly in Northern Victoria and regional Australia?
Many clearly don't. You've seen especially in the cities, a lot of people who were lock me down harder, Daddy. A lot of people think Dan Andrews did a wonderful job, and he saved them from the pandemic. So clearly, a lot of people would rather trade their freedom for safety. And you've seen that in the creeping safetyism over the last 30, 40 years, where the government's restricted more and more things you can do to protect you from yourself. In regional Victoria, there is still a greater love of freedom. Not to say that it's freedom libertopia. It's not. The same viruses that work in regional Victoria as in the cities, but it's not as far gone. There is still far greater love of freedom, choice, doing your own things out here than in the city. And where I'm going with that is, I talked about in my maiden speech was Rexit, the idea of a regional exit, that we would break away the parts of regional Victoria from Greater Melbourne and create a whole new state. And as we've developed that idea, I also want to do the same thing with regional New South Wales, break away Sydney, Newcastle, Wollongong, which is what New South Wales, NSW stands for Newcastle, Sydney, Wollongong, of course. The rest of the state doesn't matter. So take a large chunk of regional New South Wales and most of regional Victoria, make a whole new state where we get to write a new constitution, which will limit the size of government, enumerate our rights to a proper Bill of Rights that's protected, limit the government's power to tax and grow bigger, and basically get a chance to reset, rebuild with a smaller, leaner public service distributed across the whole state rather than clumping in one place, with services distributed as much as possible being done privately rather than by government, and with people having real rights to live as they choose. If we don't do that, regional Victoria will cease to exist. All the towns, the little towns are dying now. They're being blown away. You see the timber towns that won't exist in 10 years when the government's turned the timber industry off. Irrigation towns that won't exist because the water's been turned off and there's no jobs. mining towns that won't exist because the mining's been shut down. And even the biggest communities in the regional Victoria, like Bendigo and Ballarat, will in the end be just dormitory feeder towns for Melbourne, and nothing else will matter. If we break the chains, set ourselves free, we can actually create a thriving regional economy based on jobs, based on mining, timber, agriculture, manufacturing. We can build proper cheap electricity for the nuclear industry, and we could actually be the biggest, strongest state in Australia. Well, not biggest, largest, and economically strongest and freest. So when I talked about Brexit in my maiden speech, it was partly tongue-in-cheek, but by this stage, I'm deadly serious about it, and I absolutely want to see it happen, and it will happen. And so when I say I'm not a passionate Victorian, I'm a passionate regional Victorian, and I want to see a new state, the state of Murray, or we'll call it something, whatever, but not Melbourne.
Well, speaking of passionate regional Victorians, you're number 2 on the ticket for Northern Victoria. He is also a Tim. I'm going to add him to the stream now. This is Tim Molesworth. He is from regional Victoria, and he's also a passionate libertarian like Tim Quilty. Welcome to the show, Tim. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
So can you just tell us a little bit about yourself, how you came to find the Lib Dems, and what it's like running as another Tim, the Tim ticket?
Yeah, so, well, I found the Lib Dems during the lockdowns, like probably a lot of people that are watching. Previous to that, I was interested in minor parties, but because I followed a lot of American politics, I saw the name Democrats and sort of had ignored the party. Once I saw Tim and David make their stance during the lockdowns, I realised there's something more to this party that I'd been ignoring, and I looked into them, and my values lined up with the Liberal Democrats, so I'd misjudged them on a name.
Well, a lot of people have done that in the past, but we'll forgive you, and thank you for running on the ticket with Tim. So what is the issue, or how did you find the Liberal Democrats, and how did you become a libertarian?
So I found the Liberal Democrats, like I said, through sort of watching what Tim and David were doing in Parliament, and also watching Topher Field, which again, a lot of people probably found Liberal Democrats that way. And my libertarian values, I think, sort of came from an instinct I had from a very young age. So I grew up in a very conservative household. And then my tendency is that for the most part, people should just be left alone, particularly when it comes to the government. I always considered myself conservative, watched a lot of American politics, had a sort of an interest in what was going on there. Australian politics mattered, but was a bit boring to watch, unfortunately. And as I was watching a lot of American stuff, people kept talking about these libertarians, and I once I started watching, some people might know Tim Pool is an American commentator there, libertarian of sorts, and started realising that, you know, conservatism works for me and my family, but I don't think it's what the government should be doing, and I line up with the libertarians. And Topher Field sort of solidified all of that for me.
Fantastic. And Tim Quilty, he is at home tonight for the first time in a while, and he's set up his background behind the fridge, so no one can have a snack during Liberty Chat in the Quilty household. Tim Molesworth, so you said you're conservative. You describe yourself as a Christian, but you also believe you can be a libertarian and a Christian, which is interesting debate that happens in our circles. Are you concerned about the encroachment on freedom of expression, freedom of religion, and free speech?
Absolutely. I mean, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, that these are fundamental things to libertarian values, whether you're religious or not. And, you know, that includes freedom to not religion. Yeah, you know, and we're seeing that encroach from social aspects, but also from the government, and the government encourages that, and you know, it makes it very hard for religious people sometimes. So particularly Christians, seem to be under attack at the moment. Also, Judaism and sometimes even the Muslims. And it's just not acceptable in our country, I don't think.
And another thing that you've said is that you've never previously contemplated entering politics, which for me is actually the good sign as a candidate for the Libertarian Party, because we don't really want to get involved in politics. We want to be left alone. And you said you were concerned with the bullying, threats and silencing of genuine discussion and debate. Is that one of the other issues that draws you to our party?
Yeah, so, I mean, I don't know, you could have, like, say, a climate change debate, and I'm not particularly qualified nor maybe have the time to really look into these things to make a decision on what's happening there. But it seems to me that the debate gets shut down, particularly, from government. So they'll say, oh, you're just a science denier if you ask questions, which is fundamental to science. And also, social media is an issue. I don't know what you do about that, but I'd like to start by getting the government out of the way.
And what's it like running as Tim Quilty's number 2? And who's had more scones with jam and cream at this stage of the campaign?
I think Tim's ahead of me on the scones and cream, but I did start off pretty early. So hopefully I can catch up with him and maybe win that one.
Tim might be ahead on the salami front.
Yeah, I've already got a couple of salamis out of it that they weren't given to me. I just received them. So thanks for that.
We stayed at Tim's place on Monday night and left. We were gifted some homemade salamis earlier in the day, but we left them in the fridge. So Tim is now, we presume, eating them. And I'm very irritated.
There's actually one left, so.
Well, thank you for running as Tim's number 2, Tim Molesworth. These are your Northern Victorian upper house candidates. We wish you all the best with the campaign, and thank you for coming on the show tonight. Sorry to rush through you. I didn't expect Tim Quilty would be my longest interview on Liberty Chat, but there we go. So I'll take you out the stream now, Tim Molesworth, but here's your number 2 for Northern Victoria. He'll be there on the ground with Tim for the election. So this is your lineup for Northern Victoria. Pretty impressive lineup. So thank you so much for joining us, Tim.
Oh, thank you.
Our next guest on the show, he's no stranger to the party and those who've been involved in the party for the last few years. He helped behind the scenes with the biggest federal election campaign in our party's history. He's a little bit of a reluctant candidate, but he's nevertheless reliable. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the show, the lead candidate for Eastern Victoria, Rob McCathie. Hi, Rob.
Hi, Kate, and welcome to my show. Thank you.
Yeah, so Rob actually helped behind the scenes Liberty Chat when we first got it up and running, which was before I came back to the party. So this is Rob McCathie's Liberty Chat, and he's at the front of the camera tonight. So we're grateful to have him as a candidate. He has been a member of the party for a long time, like myself and like Tim. So we're old party hands. Why are you running in Eastern Victoria, and what's your electorate like?
I'm running in Eastern Victoria, firstly, obviously for the baseline things you'd expect from the Liberal Democrats, for freedom, liberty, free speech, for people to go about their business, so long as they're not hurting someone else, and not be interfered with, so long as they're doing that. And for the region in particular, there's certainly issues in the energy sector that relates to Eastern Victoria. But one of the key things that I'm really concerned with is what we're seeing with local people with local knowledge, volunteer organisations who know how to manage things in their area, and they're basically being, for no good reason that I can see, shut down from doing that. Like we've seen it with the CFA, and I think there's more incoming. But yeah, basically in regional areas, Tim was saying it before, that people know what they're doing. They know how to manage these things, and some city bureaucrats don't need to be dictating to them how things should be, because they'll mess it up and the people with local knowledge will not. So that's the key things, at least.
So
I had a meeting. Sorry, I'll just shove myself in here.
Right.
I was meeting with timber workers on Monday and Tuesday, and they were these are people who have world-class timber management skills. They are protecting the forest. They log it. They regenerate it. They protect it from fires. Without what they do, the endangered species will die out because they need areas cleared with young growth. We have these Melbourne greenies saying we must lock it up to save the glider. No, you're going to kill the glider. You're going to kill the pygmy possum, the lead-bearded possum with what you're doing. The timber industry for 150 years has been protecting these areas, regenerating them, and if we lock it all up, everything's going to die. But these experts in the city who've been to university but never been in the real world are creating a catastrophe. Yeah, I'll shut up again.
That's good. I'm loving this. You're a great host to have on the show. So, Rob, what are the biggest issues and policies that are resonating with people in Eastern Victoria?
So the main one, and I've already just touched on it in the introduction, there is volunteer organisations. It even goes to what Tim was just saying. There's the situation with the CFA, but it's also a number of other volunteer or local groups. I'm kind of repeating what Tim just said. It was the topic I was going to go into. Underbrush in forests and such. There's both volunteer organisations who can go in and deal with it, or even not volunteer, even if they're not. There's going to have to be whatever. They're still the best people to do it, and even the various farmers. I've heard stories about cattle grazing in areas where the cattle will eat the underbrush, and they're not being allowed to do it. So that's it. And look, as another thing, that it's not specific to Eastern Victoria region or regional areas. It's something for all Victorians to worry about. And going back to sort of more baseline Liberal Democrats, Libertarian stuff, there was an inquiry in Parliament in, I think it was early 2020, their legal and social issues committee. They came back with recommendations for the government. Basically, the recommendations, which the government seems to be largely accepting, is to stop types of speech they don't like, and it's about incitement, but it's not incitement of violence. It's incitement of things like ridicule or contempt for all these various groups, like the typical lefty stuff you'd imagine, gender identity, sex characteristics, yada yada. And even a personal association, which I don't even know what that means, is on the list of things that they want to stop anyone ever inciting ridicule of. I call it, the anti-meme law. Basically, you post something a little tiny bit spicy on social media or something, and the next day, we're in the situation you see, like in Britain, where you post something, and the next day the cops are at your door and you're in legal trouble just because you expressed an opinion that someone was offended by. All of this stuff is ridiculous, and I'll be fighting against all of it, whether elected or not.
So you've had a few events in your electorate. You had the screening of Battleground Melbourne in Morwell on Monday night that I was very glad to attend. I was invited out to dinner with international superstar Zuby, but I decided to come and support you in Morwell, and you're more important. So if elected, what is the main issue that you'll represent for Eastern Victoria and that you'll prosecute in the Parliament?
Well, the main thing, and I'm sort of rehashing what I've already said, but it will be energy sector and it will be volunteer organisations. They will be the two main things. I also, regarding roads, it's a long-standing Liberal Democrats policy. Roads, if we're going to have them and be taxed and everything, they need to be maintained. I was driving out on the roads in Eastern Victoria, as we just said, in the last couple of days, and I'm like, oh, this is a bit pitiful. They need to be looked after, and then we can increase speed limits so that people can get around in our massive regions, because Eastern Victoria region, Northern Victoria region, and Western Victoria region are geographically gigantic compared to the 5 metro regions. So we need to have solid roads we can drive on, and drive on them a little bit faster than we are, so we can all get around more quickly, stay more focused when we're driving, and make the geographical situation not have as much impact.
Obviously, libertarians hate roads. That's axiomatic. But
yeah, I was on the border there, Tim. I'm like, am I saying the government needs to be funding roads here? No, but we do. We have to have properly. If we're going to have roads, government funded, they're going to be maintained. Yes.
While the government's in charge and doing this stuff, we've got to keep the roads open. And I did a tyre on the highway last week. The potholes are everywhere. I went to when I went to get my tyres replaced. The constant stream of people coming in, potholes, with tyres being fixed. The roads are breaking up. We also need to get the railway lines running again for freight. Now, it's not extraordinarily libertarian to be talking about roads and government-run roads and rail, and I am happy to have a privatised system delivering it at some point, but from where we are now, we need to get these roads fixed, we need the rails fixed, and it's government's job for now to do it, and we can push them to do it.
I'm really glad the particular navigation GPS app that I use when I'm driving actually alerts me when there's huge potholes coming up that people have reported. I'm glad that happened, because some of the potholes I saw driving around Eastern Victoria on the highway and everything were, I'm glad I didn't hit them, because they were big.
Well, Rob, we're very grateful to have you as a candidate for Eastern Victoria. You've been around the party for a long time now. You're well known, you're respected, you work hard. Yes, you've got an iconic old school Lib Dem sign, a corflute from probably New South Wales 2019 election, perhaps, circa 2019.
I think it was even earlier. I think they got shipped down here for the 2018 election for Tim and Dave, where Tim and David got in.
Yes.
I'm pretty sure
I remember them from David Linehelm's office. I've been around a long time too. So tell us, how can we support your campaign? How can people help you out in Eastern Vic?
Hit up our website, please. On there, you can volunteer, you can donate, you can get more across our policies. I believe if it's not up now, it will be up very, very soon. In fact, I think it's already up on our website. If people want flyers to drop in letterboxes, if they want corflutes, whether it be for myself in Eastern Victoria or for any of our candidates, vic.ldp.org.au, under the election 2022 section, there is now a flyers, corflutes and signboards area, and you can request stuff there. So that would be really helpful. I've had a great response. I already, on the way back from Morwell, I went all through a bunch of areas and dropped corflutes off to people. It was great, but that's it. Volunteer, join the party, donate if you can, please, and distribute materials, put corflutes up in front of your house, all that.
And Tim, you'll be at the Oxley Bush Market next Saturday, the 29th of October, your office tells me. How can people help your campaign in Northern Vic?
It's pretty much the same thing. We need volunteers for the election. So for pre-poll and for polling, to hand out how to vote cards. That's going to be a massive thing. In Northern Victoria, we have hundreds and hundreds of polling booths. We've never manned more than a fraction of them. At this election, we may man more than we have in the past, but we're still going to only man a fraction of them. So volunteers who are willing to hand out how to vote cards at pre-poll and on the election day. If anyone wants to volunteer to deliver letterbox pamphlets, that's really useful. People can come along and when I come out to a community and so we have the Oxley Market next weekend, next Saturday. I'm just wondering, where am I this Saturday? There's a show on up here in a little town nearby. Anyway, it'll come back to me in a second.
Well, I can give a quick plug if you want a second, Tim. Or
yeah.
Just a quick one too, especially since my region does come in as far as sort of Pakenham, Officer, Beaconsfield, towards the city. There is David Limbrick's members and supporters event this Saturday. If you go to vic.ldp.org.au, hit events, you can see it. I realise it might be a bit far to travel for some people, but certainly people from Pakenham and those areas, if they want to head into Noble Park and hit up that event, please do.
It's the Myrtleford show on this Saturday. I'll be up there if we don't get flooded out by rain. And rain could, of course, disrupt everything that's happening in the next few weeks up here. But yes, so volunteers, if you can't volunteer and you want to help donate to the party, we can run advertising. We're trying to get some billboards up in Northern Victoria. I talked to a billboard guy recently, and he said, "Oh, we can put your billboards in Northern Victoria. We can't give you anything in Bendigo because the Labor Party won't like it, but in other places they can." So that's how they roll up here. Bendigo's a Labor town. But volunteer, contact us. Put up golf flutes to show the golf flutes have the signs behind me on your fence to show that real people vote for us. We're not do exist as a party. It's not just some fancy on the internet. Actual real people support us. But yeah, get in touch.
And if you volunteer for Tim Quilty, you might be lucky enough to get one of these iconic Tim Quilty survey holders. So now that's all we have time for tonight. Thank you so much for joining us, Tim Quilty, and thank you for everything that you've done. In my campaign speech for WA, I said I thought we were very similar. We're both country kids, passionate about the regions, and tonight that's solidified that and even more. And I'm so proud to be here helping you get re-elected. So thank you so much for everything that you do. And we've come to the end of episode 2. I just have to show the authorisation to keep the VEC happy. So authorised by R. Westgarth, Liberal Democratic Party, 117/757 Burke Street, Docklands, Vic 3008. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.